Las Vegas, August 12, 1964. The Sands Casino showroom was electric with anticipation as 412 guests filled every seat. Standing room only at the back, with celebrities, high rollers, and Vegas insiders packed shoulder to shoulder. It should have been another triumphant night for Dean Martin. Fresh off signing a record-breaking 5-year, $3 million contract with the Sands. But nothing about this night will be normal because sitting in the owner's booth, watching with cold calculation, was Carl Cohen, the man they call the Iron Fist, a casino boss who'd made or destroyed more entertainment careers than anyone in Nevada history. What happened next would force the most powerful man in Vegas to his knees, expose the cruelty behind the glittering casino empire, and change how Las Vegas treated its workers forever. This is the story of the night Dean Martin rewrote the rules of power in Sin City with nothing but dignity and a secret investment that nobody saw coming. Dean Martin arrived at the Sands at 10:47 p.m. that night, exactly 73 minutes before showtime. He parked his dual gear in his reserved spot near performer's entrance, the same spot he'd used for 6 years. The August heat still radiated off the pavement even after sunset, that dry desert heat that made the neon glow seem to shimmer and dance. Dean wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo, black with silk lapels, his signature red pocket square folded just so. He moved through the backstage corridors with the easy confidence of a man who performed in this room hundreds of times. But something was different tonight. Dean's attention kept drifting to the casino floor visible through the backstage windows, watching the dealers and cocktail waitresses moving through their routines. At 11:03 p.m., Dean stood in the wings watching the opening act finish their set. That's when he first noticed Maria Gonzalez. She was 26 years old, a cocktail waitress who'd worked at the Sands for 14 months. Maria moved between tables carrying a tray of drinks, wearing the standard Sands uniform, the short sequin outfit that caught the spotlight. But what caught Dean's attention wasn't the uniform. It was the way Maria held her head slightly turned to the left, the way she moved carefully, deliberately, like someone trying not to draw attention to an injury. When Maria turned to serve a table near the stage entrance, Dean saw it clearly. A dark purple bruise spread across her right cheekbone, partially covered with makeup, but still visible under the harsh backstage lights. Dean caught Maria's eye as she passed. "You okay, honey?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying that gentle concern that made him different from so many Vegas performers who never looked twice at the service staff. Maria stopped, glancing around nervously to see if anyone was watching. "I'm fine, Mr. Martin. Just clumsy, you know." Walked into a door. Dean had heard that excuse before. He'd grown up in Steubenville, Ohio, where men use their fists to solve problems, and women learned to make excuses. He recognized the lie immediately, but he didn't push. "Not yet. You need anything, you come find me. Doesn't matter when." Maria's eyes filled with tears, just for a second, before she blinked them away and nodded. She disappeared into the casino floor, and Dean watched her go, his expression hardening just slightly, the easy smile replaced with something more serious. What Dean didn't know yet was that earlier that evening, around 8:30 p.m., Maria had been serving drinks in the high roller section when a regular customer, an oil executive from Texas named Bill Harrington, had grabbed her by the wrist and pulled her onto his lap. The man was drunk, belligerent, surrounded by his business associates who laughed and encouraged him. Maria had tried to extract herself politely, professionally, the way the Sands training manual instructed. But Harrington wouldn't let go. He'd slid his hand up her leg and made a suggestion so crude that even his friends looked uncomfortable. Maria had done what she was trained to do. She'd called for security. But before security arrived, the floor manager, a man named Vincent Russo, who reported directly to Carl Cohen, had intervened. Russo had pulled Maria aside, away from Harrington's table, and delivered a message that was clear and cold. "Mr. Harrington spends $40,000 a weekend here. You make $12 a shift plus tips. Do the math. Get back out there, smile pretty, and if he wants to be friendly, you be friendly back." "He assaulted me," Maria had said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'm calling the police." That's when Russo had grabbed Maria by the arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks. "You call the police, you're fired. You're fired and blacklisted. You'll never work on the Strip again. And I'll make sure every casino in Vegas knows you're a troublemaker who costs us high rollers." Then, as if to emphasize his point, Russo had shoved Maria backward. She'd stumbled, catching herself on a slot machine, but her face had connected with the corner of the machine's chrome edge. The bruise Dean saw was a result. Maria had spent the next 2 hours in the employee bathroom, crying and holding ice wrapped in paper towels against her face, trying to decide if she could afford to quit. She had 2 children, ages 4 and 7, and no husband. The father had disappeared before the second child was born. Maria's mother watched the kids while Maria worked the night shift, but her mother was 68 and had diabetes. The medications cost money. The rent cost money. Everything cost money. So Maria had covered the bruise as best she could with makeup from her purse, and she'd gone back to work, because that's what people without options do. But what nobody in that room knew was that Dean Martin had spent the afternoon before the show doing something that would change everything. At 2:15 p.m. that same day, Dean had met with Bernard Rothkopf and Charles Candell, 2 of the principal owners of the Sand Hotel and Casino, in a private conference room on the executive floor. The meeting had been scheduled for weeks, kept quiet, discussed only in the most confidential terms. Dean had arrived carrying a briefcase containing cashier's checks totaling $1.8 million. By 3:40 p.m., when the meeting concluded, Dean Martin owned 11% of the Sands Hotel and Casino. He wasn't just a performer anymore. He was an owner. He was management. But Dean had requested that the deal remain confidential until the paperwork was fully processed and filed with the Nevada Gaming Commission, a process that would take several weeks. So when Dean walked into the Sands that night, nobody except Rothkopf, Candell, and their attorneys knew that Dean was now one of the bosses. Carl Cohen certainly didn't know. Cohen was 51 years old in August of 1964, a man who'd built his reputation on intimidation and control. He'd started as a bookmaker in Cleveland, moved to Miami working for Meyer Lansky's operations, and eventually landed in Las Vegas in 1958 when he was hired to run the casino floor at the Sands. Cohen was a genius with numbers, a man who could calculate odds in his head faster than most people could use a calculator. But his real talent was reading people. He knew when someone was lying, when someone was desperate, when someone could be pushed. Cohen had risen to become part owner of the Sands by being smarter and more ruthless than everyone around him. He didn't believe in sentiment. He believed in profit margins, house advantages, and maintaining absolute control over his domain. Cohen had a particular philosophy about performers. He viewed them as necessary expenses, like electricity or air conditioning. They drew crowds, but they also made demands, wanted special treatment, acted like they were important. Cohen tolerated this because the money they brought in exceeded the irritation they caused, but he never forgot who really ran the operation. The casino ran the casino. The money ran the casino. Everything else was decoration. And Cohen made sure that every performer who worked the Sands understood that they were replaceable, that their fame meant nothing the moment they walked into his building. He'd fired headliners before for being difficult. He'd blacklisted performers who questioned his decisions. The entertainment industry was built on fear and insecurity, and Cohen wielded both like surgical instruments. Dean Martin represented everything Cohen resented about performers. Dean was genuinely liked by the staff, which Cohen viewed as weakness that undermined management authority. Dean treated cocktail waitresses and janitors with the same respect he showed to casino executives, which Cohen believed gave workers ideas above their station. Dean had negotiated his $3 million contract directly with the ownership group, bypassing Cohen entirely, which was a public humiliation that Cohen hadn't forgotten. But most of all, Dean had a quality that Cohen fundamentally distrusted. Dean seemed to not care what people thought of him. Cohen's entire power structure was built on people caring desperately what he thought, fearing his disapproval, craving his approval. Dean Martin's indifference to Cohen's authority drove Cohen crazy in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Their relationship had been deteriorating for months. 3 months earlier, in May of 1964, Cohen had instituted a new policy requiring all performers to attend mandatory publicity events without additional compensation. Dean had simply not shown up, sending a polite note explaining that his contract specified performance obligations, but not promotional appearances, and that he'd be happy to discuss adding promotional work for appropriate additional compensation. Cohen had been furious, but the contract was clear and Dean was technically correct. 2 months after that, Cohen had demanded that all performers use the main entrance when arriving for shows, creating photo opportunities for fans and press gathered outside. Dean had continued using the performer's entrance, explaining that he preferred to prepare quietly before shows rather than sign autographs while trying to focus. Again, Cohen could do nothing because there was no policy that actually required what he was demanding. But the real breaking point had come 2 weeks before this night, on July 29th, when Cohen had fired a stagehand named Robert Chin for being too slow in setting up for a show. Chin was 53 years old, a Chinese immigrant who'd worked at the Sands for 9 years with a spotless record. But Chin had a limp from childhood polio, and while he completed all his work perfectly, he moved slower than younger crew members. Cohen wanted a younger, faster crew. He'd fired Chin on the spot, with 2 weeks severance and no explanation beyond performance issues. Dean had heard about Chin's firing from the stage manager, a woman named Dorothy Pierce, who'd worked in Vegas entertainment for 20 years. Dorothy had come to Dean's dressing room visibly upset, explaining that Chin had 3 children in college and a wife recovering from surgery, that the firing was cruel and unnecessary, that Chin had been humiliated in front of the entire crew. Dean had asked for Chin's home address. Then Dean had called Robert Chin personally, inviting him to the Sands for coffee the next morning. They'd met in a quiet corner booth at the Garden Room restaurant at 9 a.m. Dean had offered Chin a position working directly for Dean's production company at $200 per week, significantly more than Chin had been making at the Sands, with full health benefits and a guarantee of work on all Dean's future projects. Chin had wept openly at the table, overwhelmed with gratitude and relief. When Cohen found out 3 days later that Dean had hired Chin, he'd been apoplectic with rage. He confronted Dean in the hallway outside the showroom, his face red, a vein visibly pulsing in his temple. "You hired Chin? Are you trying to undermine me? Are you trying to make me look bad?" Dean had looked at Cohen with that famous half-smile, the one that never quite reached his eyes when he was dealing with someone he didn't respect. "Carl, I hired a talented man who needed work. What you did with your staffing has nothing to do with me. Everything in this casino has to do with me." Cohen had shot back. "I run this place. Me. Not you. Not Rothkopf. Not the board. Me. And when you undercut my decisions, you make me look weak. Then maybe make better decisions." Dean had said calmly and walked away, leaving Cohen standing in the hallway, shaking with anger and humiliation. That confrontation had been brewing for 2 weeks, festering in Cohen's mind, growing into something darker and more vengeful. Cohen had spent the intervening days watching Dean, looking for an opportunity to reassert his dominance, to remind everyone who actually held power in the building. And tonight, Summit Week, with the showroom packed with Vegas's most influential players, with high rollers and celebrities and media watching. Cohen had decided tonight was a night to put Dean Martin in his place once and for all. Here's where it gets unbelievable, because what was about to happen would later be described by everyone who witnessed it as the most stunning public confrontation in Vegas history, a moment when a carefully maintained illusion of casino glamour cracked open to reveal the ugliness underneath, and one man stood in that crack refusing to look away. At 11:58 p.m., Dean Martin walked onto the Sands showroom stage to thunderous applause. The band, led by conductor Lou Brown, played Dean's entrance music, that swinging arrangement that signaled everything cool and effortless about the Rat Pack era. Dean waved the crowd, that casual wave that looked like he was greeting friends in his living room rather than performing for hundreds of paying customers. He settled onto the stool at center stage, adjusted the microphone, and began his opening patter, the easy jokes and self-deprecating humor that put audiences at ease. "I just flew in from Palm Springs, and boy are my arms tired. That's an old joke. I'm an old man. It works out." The crowd laughed. Dean sipped from a glass on his stool. The glass everyone assumed contained whiskey, but actually contained apple juice. That was Dean's secret, the thing most people never knew. The drunk persona was an act, carefully crafted, but Dean rarely drank during performances. He wanted control, wanted to be present, wanted to see everything happening in the room. The glass was a prop, part of the character, but Dean's mind was sharp and focused. 23 minutes into the show, at 12:21 a.m., Dean began singing Everybody Loves Somebody. It was his signature song, the one that had knocked the Beatles' A Hard Day's Night off the top of the Billboard charts just weeks earlier. The audience settled into that comfortable appreciation. Couples holding hands, people swaying slightly to the music. Dean's voice filled the room, that smooth baritone that made even sentimental lyrics sound sophisticated. Everybody loves somebody sometime. Everybody falls in love somehow. That's when the showroom doors burst open. Carl Cohen strode through the entrance, moving fast, his shoulders squared, his jaw set. He wasn't alone. 2 security guards flanked him, big men in dark suits who cleared a path through the tables. The audience members turned confused, wondering if this was part of the show, some Vegas spectacle they weren't understanding. But the people who knew Cohen, the regulars and insiders, they went quiet immediately. They recognized that look on Cohen's face. They'd seen it before, usually right before someone got hurt. Dean saw Cohen coming. He kept singing, didn't miss a note, but his eyes tracked Cohen's progress through the room. Lou Brown and the band saw Cohen too. Brown looked at Dean, a question in his eyes, but Dean gave a tiny shake of his head. Keep playing. Cohen reached the stage and climbed the 3 steps at stage right without slowing down. He walked directly to Dean, reached out, and physically grabbed the microphone from Dean's hand. The music stuttered to a confused halt. The room went absolutely silent, that shocked silence when something unscripted and wrong is clearly happening. 412 people held their breath collectively. Cohen held the microphone, breathing hard, his face flushed. He looked out at the audience, then back at Dean. Dean stood slowly, setting down his drink, his movements calm and deliberate. He was several inches taller than Cohen, but he didn't use the height aggressively. He just stood, waiting, his expression neutral. Ladies and gentlemen, Cohen said into the microphone, his voice tight with barely controlled rage, I apologize for the interruption, but I think you need to know who you're really watching tonight. This man, he gestured at Dean, this drunk thinks he runs my casino. The gasp from the audience was audible, shocked murmurs rippling through the crowd. Frank Sinatra was sitting at table 7 with Sammy Davis Jr. and Joey Bishop. Sinatra started to rise from his chair, but Dean caught his eye and shook his head slightly. Stay. Cohen continued, building momentum. Dean Martin thinks because he's famous, because you people pay to see him stumble around stage pretending to be drunk, that he's in charge here. But let me tell you something. This is my casino. I built this showroom. I made the Sands what it is. And I'm done with performers who think they're bigger than this place. Dean stood perfectly still, his hands relaxed at his sides. His face showed nothing, no anger, no embarrassment, no fear. He just listened. So here's what's going to happen, Cohen said, his voice rising. I'm canceling Dean Martin's contract. Effective immediately. Martin, you're done at the Sands. And you're blacklisted from every casino I have influence over. And that's all of them. Every casino on the Strip. Every casino in Reno. Every gaming establishment in this state. You're finished in Nevada. The room erupted in shocked conversation. People turned to each other, unable to believe what they were hearing. This didn't happen. Performers didn't get fired mid-show. Headliners didn't get blacklisted on stage. This was chaos, scandal, the kind of story that would dominate Vegas gossip for years. But Cohen wasn't finished. He turned to Dean, the microphone now lowered slightly, speaking more directly to Dean but still audible to the front rows. You want to know what did it? Earlier tonight, you defended that waitress, Maria, the little bleeding heart case who can't follow simple instructions. She refused to be friendly to a customer spending $40,000 at my tables. And when my floor manager corrected the situation, you made a problem. You talked to her. You encouraged her. You made her think she could challenge my staff's authority. Cohen's voice dripped with contempt. That's your problem, Martin. You're a bleeding heart who side with waitresses over management. You think being nice to the help makes you a good person? It makes you weak. It makes you a fool. These people. Cohen gestured vaguely toward the casino floor, toward where staff members stood frozen watching. They're here to serve. That's their job. They don't need you protecting them. They need to do their jobs and be grateful they have them. What happened in the next 60 seconds will become the most quoted, analyzed, and retold moment in Las Vegas history. A perfect encapsulation of grace under pressure, of power use or protection rather than domination, of a man who understood that true strength meant defending those who couldn't defend themselves. Dean stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Cohen. He didn't reach for the microphone. He didn't make any aggressive movement. He simply looked at Cohen, those brown eyes steady and calm, and he spoke quietly. The room was so silent that his voice carried without amplification. "Carl, you forgot something." Cohen blinked, confused by Dean's composure. "What?" Dean's expression didn't change. "You said this is your casino. You said you're canceling my contract and blacklisting me from your properties. But you forgot something important. What are you talking about?" Cohen's grip tightened on the microphone. "I bought 11% of the Sands last month." Dean said calmly, clearly, each word precise. "That makes me your partner, not your employee. That makes this my casino, too." The room exploded. People stood from their tables. Conversations erupted in every direction. Cohen's face went from red to white in seconds. He looked like he'd been physically struck. Dean wasn't finished. He raised his hand slightly, asking for quiet, and somehow the room obeyed, everyone desperate to hear what would happen next. The deal closed on July 20th. "I own 11% of this hotel, this casino, and this showroom. I didn't announce it because the paperwork was still being processed with the Gaming Commission, but Bernard Rothkopf and Charles Candell can confirm it right now if you'd like to call them." Cohen's mouth opened and closed, no sound coming out. His two security guards looked at each other, uncertain what to do. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Dean took another step forward, close enough now that he could have reached out and taken a microphone if he'd wanted to, but he still didn't. He kept his voice level, conversational, like he was explaining something to a friend rather than destroying a man's authority in front of hundreds of witnesses. "Now, as part owner of this casino, I have some decisions to make. My first act? I'm promoting Maria Gonzalez to shift supervisor with triple her current salary. That's $600 a week for anyone keeping track. She'll be responsible for training and staff protection protocols, making sure that what happened to her tonight never happens to anyone else who works here." The applause started scattered, then built, then became a standing ovation. Maria Gonzalez stood frozen by the bar, tears streaming down her face, her hands covering her mouth in shock. Dean found her in the crowd and gave her a small nod. "My second act," Dean continued, and now his voice carried an edge, still calm but with steel underneath. "I'm donating my next 6 months of performance fees. That's $340,000, Carl, since you're good with numbers, to create a staff protection fund. Any employee at the Sands who faces harassment, who faces assault, who faces retaliation for defending themselves, will have access to legal support, medical care, and financial assistance while we investigate their complaints and take appropriate action." The room had gone quiet again, but it was a different quality of silence now. This was respect, awe, the recognition that they were witnessing something historic. But the truth behind what really happened, the part that makes this story more than just a dramatic confrontation, requires understanding who Dean Martin really was when the cameras weren't rolling, when the drunk persona was gone, when it was just Dean and the people who needed help. In 1962, 2 years before this night, Dean had been performing at the Copacabana in New York when a young black performer named Raymond Johnson had been denied entry to the club despite being scheduled to perform in the opening act. The doorman had claimed there was a dress code issue, but everyone knew the real reason. Dean had been in his dressing room preparing for the show when his stage manager mentioned the situation. Dean had walked out to the lobby in his tuxedo, found Raymond Johnson standing on the sidewalk looking defeated, and had put his arm around the younger man's shoulders. "You're with me," Dean had said simply. Then Dean had walked Johnson to the front entrance, past the doorman who'd refused him, and into the dressing room. Dean had performed his set that night, then brought Raymond Johnson on stage with him, introduced him to the audience as one of the most talented young performers in America, and let Johnson perform a 15-minute set in the middle of Dean's own show. The next day, Dean had called the Copacabana management and made it clear, integrate your policies or I never perform here again. The Copacabana changed their policies. In 1963, Dean had learned that one of his childhood friends from Steubenville, a man named Tommy Rizzo who'd worked in the steel mills with Dean's father, was dying of lung cancer. Tommy had no health insurance, no savings, and 5 children. Dean had called Tommy's wife and asked what they needed. The answer was everything: medical bills, mortgage payments, food, college funds for the kids. Dean had written a check for $85,000, enough to cover all the medical expenses, pay off the house, and set up trust funds for all 5 children. He'd included a note that said simply, "Tommy's friendship meant everything to me. Let me help." When word got out months later, and a reporter asked Dean about it, Dean had waved off the question. "Tommy would have done the same for me," he'd said, even though everyone knew Tommy never had money to spare. In early 1964, just 6 months before the Sands confrontation, Dean had been filming Robin in the 7 Hoods with Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. when the crew members, a lighting technician named Patricia Walsh, had mentioned during a lunch break that her daughter needed surgery to correct a severe cleft palate. The surgery would cost $12,000, money Patricia didn't have. Her insurance covered only a portion. Dean had listened to Patricia talk about how her daughter was bullied at school, how the child wouldn't smile because she was ashamed of her appearance, how Patricia worked double shifts trying to save enough money. 3 days later, Patricia had received an envelope at her home. Inside was a cashier's check for $15,000 and a note. "For your daughter's surgery and recovery. She deserves to smile. Dean." Patricia had tried to thank him on set the next day, but Dean had changed the subject immediately, uncomfortable with gratitude, unwilling to discuss it further. These weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns, a consistent demonstration of character that defined who Dean Martin was when nobody was watching. Dean gave money to fired crew members who couldn't make rent. He paid hospital bills for colleagues' family members. He sent anonymous donations to churches in poor neighborhoods. He tipped service staff absurd amounts, $500 for a $50 meal. Not to show off, but because he knew what it meant to struggle. Dean had grown up in poverty, the son of an Italian immigrant barber in a steel town where getting enough to eat was an accomplishment. He'd worked as a bootlegger, a blackjack dealer, a gas station attendant, clawing his way up through talent and determination and extraordinary charm. But Dean never forgot where he came from, never looked down on people doing the jobs he'd once done, never lost a fundamental decency that his mother had instilled in him. So when Dean stood on that stage at the Sands, confronting Carl Cohen, it wasn't about ego or pride or winning a confrontation. It was about Maria Gonzalez and every person like her, every cocktail waitress and stagehand and janitor who'd been told to shut up and be grateful, who'd been assaulted in silence, who'd been treated as disposable. Dean had money and fame and power, and he decided long ago that those things only mattered if you used them to protect people who didn't have them. This is where everything changed, because Dean wasn't done exposing Cohen's cruelty, and what came next would strip away any remaining authority Cohen thought he possessed. Dean took the microphone from Cohen's hand, gently but firmly. Cohen didn't resist, too stunned to react. Dean held the microphone and spoke directly to the audience, his voice carrying that conversational intimacy that made people feel like he was talking to them personally. "Carl called me a bleeding heart. He's right. I am. You want to know why? Let me tell you about some of the people Carl considers disposable." Dean turned slightly, looking at Cohen. "Robert Chun. You fired him 2 weeks ago. Called him too slow. Robert worked here 9 years, perfect record, never missed a shift, never complained. You fired him because he has a limp from childhood polio, and you wanted someone who moved faster. Robert has 3 kids in college, Carl. Did you think about that? Did you care? Robert's youngest daughter, Amy, she's studying to be a nurse. She wants to help people. Maybe she'll end up treating someone you love someday. But you fired her father because he walked with a limp." Cohen tried to speak, but Dean continued, his voice steady and relentless. "Linda Morrison, cocktail waitress. You fired her 8 months ago. Remember Linda? She'd worked here 4 years. Fired because she gained weight after having a baby. You called her unpresentable. Linda's husband had died in a car accident 3 months before you fired her. She was raising a newborn alone, coming to work exhausted, doing her best. You looked at her grief weight and decided she wasn't pretty enough anymore. She's working as a diner waitress in Henderson now. Carl, making a third of what she made here. But at least the diner owner doesn't comment on her body. The room had gone completely still. People weren't looking at Dean anymore. They were looking at Cohen, and what they saw was a man being methodically dismantled, his cruelty exposed in specific, undeniable detail. Dean wasn't finished. James Butler, poker dealer. You fired him 6 months ago for being unreliable. James had missed 3 shifts that month because his son was in the hospital with leukemia. His son was dying, Carl. The boy was 7 years old. James was spending nights at the hospital, watching his child fade away, and you fired him for it. You said he should have planned better, should have arranged backup care for his dying son. James's boy passed away 5 weeks after you fired him. James missed the funeral because he was working a double shift at the Flamingo trying to pay the medical bills. But at least you maintained your standards, right? Cohen's face had gone gray. He took a step backward, his mouth working but no sound emerging. The security guards had quietly stepped away, dissociating themselves from Cohen, recognizing that this was no longer their fight. You want to know what I've done while you've been firing people for being human? Dean's voice remained calm, but every person in the room could hear the controlled fury underneath. Robertson works for my production company now, making more than he made here. Linda Morrison, I called her last month and offered her a job managing my Palm Springs property. She starts next week at $180 a week with full benefits. James Butler, I couldn't bring back his son, Carl, but I could pay off his medical debt. That was $23,000. I wrote the check in January. James doesn't know it came from me. The hospital told him it was an anonymous donor. The room erupted in applause again, but Dean held up his hand, asking for quiet. He wasn't done. Maria Gonzalez, tonight, you had your floor manager tell her to accept assault from a customer because the customer spends money here. When she refused, your manager assaulted her. That bruise on her face? That's from your management, Carl. That's from your philosophy that money matters more than human dignity. You call me a bleeding heart for defending her. You're right. I defended her. I'll defend every person working in this building who gets treated like they're less than human because they serve drinks or clean rooms or deal cards. Dean stepped closer to Cohen, his voice dropping lower, more intimate, but still audible to the front rows. You said, I think I'm bigger than this place. I don't. I know exactly what this place is. It's a casino. It's gambling and entertainment. It's not sacred. It's not important. The people are important. The staff you treat like furniture, they're important. They have children who need to eat. They have dreams and dignity and the right to work without being assaulted or humiliated. You forgot that somewhere along the way. You started believing the money was the point. But money's never the point, Carl. It's just a tool. What you do with it, who you protect with it, that's what matters. The room had descended into that profound silence that comes when people realize they're witnessing something transformative, a moment when the unspoken rules that govern how society functions are being rewritten in real time. Some people were crying. Others sat with their arms crossed, nodding slowly. A few looked uncomfortable, recognizing perhaps their own complicity in systems that devalued certain kinds of people. Cohen stood there, his shoulders slumped, all the fire and rage drained out of him. He looked old suddenly, diminished, a small man whose power had been revealed as a fragile thing built on fear rather than respect. He reached for the microphone one last time, not to grab it but to lean close to it, and he spoke quietly. I apologize, Cohen said, his voice hoarse. To Maria, to everyone. I was wrong. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough. But it was acknowledgement, public and humiliating, that Dean had forced from a man who'd likely never apologized for anything in his life. Dean nodded once, accepting the apology without comment. Then he handed the microphone back to Cohen. The stage is yours if you want it. But I think the show's over for tonight. Cohen shook his head and walked off the stage, moving slowly, the security guards trailing behind him. He disappeared through the showroom doors, and the sound of his footsteps faded into the casino noise beyond. Dean turned back to the audience. He found Maria Gonzalez in the crowd and gestured for her to come forward. Maria hesitated, overwhelmed, but the people around her encouraged her, touching her shoulders, creating a path. She walked to the stage, and Dean helped her up the steps. He handed her the microphone. "Tell them what happened tonight." Dean said gently, "They should hear it from you." Maria stood there for a moment, looking out at 412 faces, all watching her, waiting. She'd spent the last 4 hours believing her career was over, that she'd have to go home and explain to her mother and her children that she'd lost her job, that they'd have to figure out how to pay the rent and buy groceries and afford her mother's medication. Now she was standing on stage with Dean Martin, being told she was promoted, being given a voice. "A customer assaulted me tonight," Maria said, her voice shaking but gaining strength. "He grabbed me. He touched me. I asked for help, and my manager told me to accept it or lose my job. When I refused, he pushed me. He gave me this." She touched her bruised cheek. "I thought I was going to be fired. I thought I'd never work again. But Mr. Martin," her voice broke. She looked at Dean. "Thank you. Thank you for seeing us. Thank you for caring." The standing ovation lasted 4 full minutes. People weren't applauding Dean, not really. They were applauding the idea that someone powerful had chosen to use that power for protection rather than exploitation, that dignity could win against cruelty, that a voice raised in defense of the vulnerable could change systems that seemed unchangeable. But the story doesn't end there, because what happened in the hours and days and years following that night would ripple outward in ways nobody could have predicted, changing Las Vegas and the entertainment industry in fundamental ways. By 3 a.m. that night, word of the confrontation had spread throughout Vegas. Performers in other casinos heard the story from dealers who heard it from cocktail waitresses who heard it from security guards who'd been called to Sands expecting a fight and instead witnessed a moral victory. The story grew in the telling, but the core remained accurate because too many people had been in that room, too many witnesses who could confirm every detail. The Las Vegas Sun got the story by 4 a.m. Their entertainment reporter, a woman named Catherine Price, who'd covered the Strip for 12 years, made calls, confirmed details, and had the story ready for the morning edition. The headline read, "Dean Martin confronts casino boss, creates worker protection fund." The story ran with a photo of Dean from earlier that week, that classic shot of him in a tuxedo, drink in hand, looking cool and untouchable. But the article focused on Maria Gonzalez, on Robertson, on the specifics of Dean's charitable giving and Cohen's cruelty. It was journalism that took a side, that made clear who the villain and hero were, because sometimes the facts are so clear that objectivity becomes unnecessary. By noon on August 13th, 14 hours after the confrontation, the Sands owner group had called an emergency meeting. Bernard Rothkopf, Charles Candell, and the other principal owners sat in the executive conference room with Dean Martin and their attorneys. Carl Cohen was notably absent, though he'd been called to the meeting. He declined to attend, sending word through his secretary that he was taking a personal day. The owners asked Dean what he wanted. Dean's answer was simple: implement the staff protection fund immediately, hire an independent HR consultant to review all employee policies, and create a grievance process where workers could report harassment without fear of retaliation. The owners agreed to all of it. They had no choice. The story was too public, the moral high ground too clearly occupied by Dean, and the potential liability for Maria Gonzalez's assault too significant to ignore. Carl Cohen resigned on August 18th, 6 days after the confrontation. The official statement said he was pursuing other opportunities and thanked him for his years of service. The reality, as reported in Variety and The Hollywood Reporter, was that Cohen had been given a choice: resign with severance package, or be fired with no severance and face a potential lawsuit from Maria Gonzalez, who now had Dean Martin paying for the best employment attorneys in Nevada. Cohen chose resignation. He left Las Vegas and moved to Miami, where he worked in a series of lesser casino management positions. He never regained the power or influence he'd held at the Sands. People in the industry remembered the confrontation. Cohen became a cautionary tale about what happened when you mistook cruelty for strength. Maria Gonzalez thrived. She became shift supervisor as Dean had promised, earning $600 a week, more than 10 times her previous salary. She used the money to move her family to a better neighborhood, to get her mother better medical care, to enroll her children in better schools. 5 years later, in 1969, Maria was promoted to floor manager, one of the first Latina women to hold that position in a major Las Vegas casino. She worked at the Sands for 23 years, until the hotel was finally demolished in 1996. In interviews years later, Maria would always say the same thing. Dean Martin saved my life, not by giving me money, though that helped. He saved me by making powerful people understand that I mattered, that my dignity wasn't negotiable. The Staff Protection Fund that Dean created became a model copied throughout the Vegas casino industry. Within 2 years, 6 other major casinos had implemented similar programs, creating resources for workers facing harassment or unsafe conditions. The fund at the Sands ultimately distributed over $2 million in assistance during the 13 years it operated, helping hundreds of employees with legal fees, medical costs, and financial emergencies. When the Sands closed in 1996, the remaining fund balance was transferred to a nonprofit organization that continues to provide worker advocacy services in Las Vegas today. Robert Chun, the stagehand fired for his limp, worked for Dean's production company for 18 years. He eventually became Dean's personal stage manager, traveling with Dean to performances across the country. Chen's daughter Amy did become a nurse, graduating from UCLA's nursing program in 1967. When asked in a college interview essay who had most influenced her decision to enter healthcare, Amy wrote about her father's dignity in the face of unjust firing, and about Dean Martin's example that power should be used to protect and heal. She worked as an oncology nurse for 37 years, specializing in treating children with cancer, the disease she'd watched nearly destroy her family when her father lost his job. Linda Morrison, the cocktail waitress fired for gaining grief weight, managed Dean's Palm Springs property for 11 years. She eventually remarried a man she met at a charity event Dean hosted at the property. She raised her daughter in Palm Springs, eventually opened her own small hotel, and built a successful life that seemed impossible on that day in December 1963, when Carl Cohen had called her unpresentable and destroyed her livelihood. In a letter to Dean written in 1975, Linda wrote, "You gave me back my dignity when someone had convinced me I had none. That's a gift I can never repay." James Butler, whose son died of leukemia, never learned that Dean had paid his medical debt until after Dean's death in 1995. When executor of Dean's estate released records of Dean's charitable giving, James saw the $23,000 payment from January 1964. James was 73 years old by then, retired, living in Las Vegas with his second wife and grandchildren from his remarriage. He gave an interview to the Las Vegas Review-Journal, crying as he recounted the story of his son's death and the mysterious anonymous donation that had saved him from bankruptcy. Dean Martin carried that secret for 31 years. James said, "He never wanted thanks. He just wanted to help. That's the definition of a good man." The Rat Pack, already beloved, became even more mythic after the Sands confrontation. Frank Sinatra, who'd watched from Table 7 that night, told reporters, "Dean did what we all wish we'd do when we see injustice. He didn't look away. He didn't make excuses. He put himself on the line for people who couldn't fight back. That's courage. That's class." Sammy Davis Jr., who'd faced his own struggles with racism and discrimination throughout his career, was even more effusive. Dean showed that being cool isn't about not caring. It's about caring so much that you stay calm even when your blood is boiling, because anger makes you sloppy and the people you're defending need you sharp. Dean was the sharpest cat I ever knew. Dean Martin continued performing at the Sands until 1973, when he moved his Vegas residency to the MGM Grand as part of a larger contract. But his ownership stake in the Sands remained until hotel sale in 1988, and Dean insisted on maintaining the Staff Protection Fund as a condition of his approval for the sale. Dean never publicly discussed the Cohen confrontation in detail. When reporters asked about it, he'd wave it off with a joke. "Carl and I had a disagreement about employee relations. We resolved it. End of story. But people who worked with Dean, who saw him interact with crew members and staff, they understood that the confrontation was an anomaly. It was who Dean was consistently when the cameras were off and the persona dropped. Years later, the truth came out about Dean's other charitable acts, the ones he'd kept secret. After Dean's death on December 25, 1995, his estate executors discovered records of hundreds of anonymous donations, loans to friends that were never meant to be repaid, medical bills paid, college tuitions covered, rent payments made for struggling families. The total exceeded $4.7 million in documented charitable giving beyond his public philanthropy, money given quietly over decades to people who needed help. That number doesn't include the countless tips, the informal help, the jobs created for people who needed work. Dean Martin spent his wealth the way he wanted others to spend their power, protecting people, lifting them up, giving them chances they wouldn't otherwise have. This is why we still tell the story 60 years later. Not because it was dramatic, though it was, and not because it featured famous people, though it did, but because it captured something essential about what character means when power and privilege are involved. Carl Cohen had power. He controlled careers, decided who worked and who didn't, wielded his authority like a weapon. Dean Martin had power too, fame and money and influence. But Dean understood that power is only worth having if you use it to protect people who don't have it. Cohen saw workers as expendable. Dean saw them as human beings with the same dignity and worth as anyone else. That difference in perspective made all the difference in outcome. On August 12, 1964, in a showroom in Las Vegas, a casino boss tried to humiliate a performer and reassert his dominance. Instead, he exposed his own cruelty and lost everything. A performer who could have ignored the situation, who could have stayed safely in his role as entertainer and avoided the confrontation, chose instead to stand up, to speak out, to use his power to defend a cocktail waitress with a bruised face and no options. That choice reverberated outward, changing policies, protecting workers, creating systems that acknowledge humanity over profit. That choice became legendary because it demonstrated what's possible when people with privilege decide that dignity isn't negotiable, that cruelty doesn't get a pass just because it's profitable, that the measure of a person isn't their status, but their willingness to defend those with less. Dean Martin wasn't perfect. He had flaws, made mistakes, hurt people who loved him in his personal life. But on that night, in that moment, when it would have been easier to look away, Dean chose to see. He chose to care. He chose to act. And in doing that, he showed everyone watching that being cool isn't about indifference. It's about having the courage to care publicly, to defend openly, to risk something you've built for people you barely know. That's the real legacy. Not the songs or the movies or the fame, though those matter. The legacy is a reminder that power is a responsibility, that privilege comes with obligation, and that the truest test of character is what you do when someone vulnerable needs defending and you're the only one with the strength to stand up. That's why, decades later, we still tell the story. Because some lessons don't age. Some moments become timeless. And some people show us who we could be if we just had the courage to see beyond ourselves and protect those who need it most.